I did too.
That's right.
You weren't going to.
Yeah, that's fine.
Have you ever been inside a world
Sometimes.
that you hate
Sometimes.
or that you love?
Sometimes. Those things, we're reading books. We often talk about world building, right? And how an author builds a setting for the story really impacts what you're doing. And really impacts how enjoyable a book is to read. And so we want to talk a little bit about some of our favorite world building books. And we actually passed on, I think, some of the ones that are the most obvious choices here, right? Instead of pulling out a Sanderson, I don't think you have a Sanderson, I don't think I have one, a Sanderson, a Rowling, a Tolkien, something like that, we're going to do a few maybe lesser thought of ones and talk about why they're either really good world building or maybe not so good at world building. And something I think that's interesting here is the complexity in the world building doesn't automatically mean it's good world building.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes simple world building works better.
Or like the pacing of it, how long it takes, not just how detailed, but how long it takes to explain something.
And how intimidating maybe it is to the reader to be able to do it, and how much the reader can grasp all matters. You can have a really rich and detailed world where you're only revealing parts of it, and the fact that you're only revealing parts of it and spoon feeding it allows readers to grasp it and understand it.
Or is it too slowly given to you that it's just like you're just lost the whole time?
Right. Or the other thing is you have a giant world and you shove it on somebody right at the beginning and then they just don't understand. Which unfortunately, speaking of my first book, is kind of where this has fallen for me. So this is the first book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. So I'm 2 books in, right? Read this one, read the next one. So Guardians of the Moon, Dead House Gates. I'm not saying I dislike it. All I'm saying is the world building, while incredibly complex and interesting, feels like I'm being hit over the head with it, right? In too much. Which is saying something because I love complex fantasy, but I find myself very lost very often, which takes away from the richness of it. The more confused I am, the less rich something feels. It reminds me a little bit about richness of flavors in a book, or like eating a meal, right? Rich flavors are great, right? They really can bring out wonderful things in a meal. But if you have too many of them all at once, all of a sudden it just tastes yucky. And that's kind of where Malazan's at for me right now, where it just is so much. And there's some good things. I'm liking it. There's some good flavors, but they're so intense that it just isn't where I think it could be. And I'm hoping that gets better as we go through the series.
You're going to keep going?
Yep, I'm going to keep going.
Okay. Right. I am like totally not even interested.
Yeah, no. And I wouldn't recommend this for you in the slightest. Cool. Right? Many books, fantasy books, I think you'd love. I don't think you would like these at all.
Sounds like I would not.
No.
So this is not actually a different world. This is our world, Outlander. But the way she wrote it, the way that it is described, it was so beautiful, so well written, and so descriptive that like I can picture all of it. I can picture this whole entire book. I
mean, it's not technically our world, right? Because it's time travel. So unless time travel existed in our world, which it doesn't, so
no. But
so
like
it's
the
an
places,
alternate.
it's not like there's different. Like it's
You're
history,
in Scotland or something.
Yeah, but it's not. It's not like it's not a brand new place with new concepts. It's our.
This actually brings up an interesting debate. It wasn't in our fantasy section when we grabbed it here. So you say it's not fantasy. It's just fiction.
That's so funny that you're the one who's like, why is it not in fantasy?
So here's the thing. I haven't read it.
Yeah, you're right.
So I don't know. I just have heard it's fantasy.
I mean, there's fantastical things. Like time travel is not real.
Sure,
That is definitely fantastical.
That's fine.
But I think
but there's not like magic or anything like that that would define it in there?
Not necessarily, no.
Oh, okay.
I do think that, well, I don't know. Maybe further down the road. I've only read 1.5 of these. I'll get to them.
Mm-hmm.
If it wasn't for your definition of fantasy, I would probably have this in fantasy.
Okay.
I think you're too strict. And that is why I did not put it in the fantasy
That's fair. And the more I know about it, the more I think maybe it shouldn't be in the fantasy shelf.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting. An interesting world building there. A good example of maybe world building not necessarily being high fantasy, right? High fantasy is where it's on a different world.
Yeah.
It maybe be low fantasy, where it's on this world. Maybe not even fantasy, but definitely still has world building.
Yeah.
I think another book that falls in that category of like House of the Cerulean Sea, which is definitely supposed to be set in our world, but in a mystical area type of thing.
Yeah.
That is that low fantasy, but but maybe not even fantasy, like it kind of fits in there, but definitely has strong world building themes, even though it's part of our world.
Right.
It's an interesting thing to say that you can build a world inside of our world.
Just the way she wrote it, I think it's just like hats off to her. It's fantastic writing. It's really, really good.
You know, it's an interesting segue to this one, because the next time I was going to read is Dresden Files, which is definitely set in our world. It's set in Chicago.
Yeah.
But it's set in a fantastical version of Chicago where the main character is a wizard fighting fantasy characters and things as the world kind of goes on without even noticing most of the time, unless they get killed by the fantasy things that they notice then. But another good example of world building inside of our world, right?
Yeah.
Which is a fascinating topic that I really didn't think about. It's amazing how you can add just another layer of richness on top of what's already there. And it actually, I think, allows you to not have to start from scratch, but you can build on this. Like, you don't have to describe to me what Chicago is, or what it looks like, or why there's certain parts of the city you don't want to go to. Instead, you can focus on some of the other things and let that setting just permeate through it.
Cool.
And build a richness from our everyday experiences. The Dresden Files are an excellent example of this. Jim Butcher does an incredible job of providing a richness for the world that's there. And this is something, I think world building helps the more books you have, right? Dresden Files has, I don't know how many, 13, 14 books, something like that. And you know, each one builds upon each other. You learn more and more about this world. You know, first a little spoon-fed, hey, here's a fantasy world. You know, I'm a wizard. There's more than one of us. There's other things going on. Hey, there's vampires. Hey, there's werewolves. Hey, like this type of thing, and it just builds and builds until you have a larger world that's there. It was always there. It just hadn't been revealed to you until you get to it, which I think is the way to do it, as opposed to, hey, here's this giant world. It's, hey, here's this little story, and a glimpse into the world. And I'm going to give you enough to make it interesting, and then build it out over time.
Cute.
So, highly recommend. Great world building in our own world, in Dresden, in the Dresden Files. Definitely recommend.
All right, we're moving dystopian, so technically our world, but really so very different
Sure.
than our world.
Yep.
I brought out Cinder because I really loved this book. I loved the world building, and I wish I could remember what the city's called. New Beijing. That's easy. Thanks. That's like in the first sentence. New Beijing is where it's at. So, and this is Cinderella, but she's a cyborg, and there's lots of, I mean, you get each princess is a different, I would say, sorry, I shouldn't say each princess. Each character in the book ties with a princess,
yeah,
or a character from some fairy tale.
Mm-hmm.
Is really well written, with the world being a huge part of the story. You can tell it's in shambles. You can tell there's like, you get the poverty section, which is where she's from. I don't know. I really loved, because it's in a city, but this book at least is in a city. The other books take place in various places. But it's because the world building is so good that this story really works, and all the places tie together.
You know, it's an interesting example because you mentioned it's dystopian, right? So it takes place on our world, but in a bad state later.
Yeah.
But it allows, the same thing happens with Dresden Files, right? Or even with Outlander, where because it takes place on this world, you can take that as the common thing for everybody to understand and then build upon it.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you just got transported to a different place, you'd have to explain it all. But saying, hey, this is 50 years, 100 years, 300 years in the future, it really gives you the ability to start from there and have it be built upon it. So it's interesting how often dystopian does that.
Crazy. Fun.
Speaking of kind of a common thing, so first, this is Promise of Blood. It's the first book in the Powder Mage series. Excellent series. Just finished it. But this does maybe a familiar thing to maybe like Outlander, right? Where it's not set in our world. Instead, I think the closest thing you could say is it would be set in alternate reality of our world, right? But what it is set in is basically a historical conflict that we know. And it's not this, but it is this. I don't know how to describe it other than saying it's basically the rise of Napoleon had Napoleon had magic, right? So the powder mages use guns and can shoot powder and stuff, and they overthrow a king and are leading these wars and things like that. But it very much feels like that type of setting. And it relies on you understanding that type of setting to be able to do it. It doesn't try and explain a bunch of things because it thinks you know enough of history to say, okay, wait a minute, what happens if we put wizards, basically, that used bullets and gunpowder to use their spells? What happens if we put them in the Napoleonic Wars or the Revolutionary War or the Civil War? But you still had all the weapons and all those type of things. what would happen there. You don't have to explain those type of wars because we all kind of know from history and from things what that was like. And so it borrows from real history to build its world in a way that is really interesting and really compelling. And the characters are awesome, well done, but an interesting world building where, hey, I'm not trying to do everything new. I'm going to borrow what's working, what you already know, and just twist it a little bit.
That's cool. I like that
Very
a lot.
good book.
Turns out I'm not good at picking new worlds. This is the Cruel Prince. Technically, this takes place in Maine, except for there's like this little doorway in Maine that takes you into this new world. So there is a new world, but it's connected to our world and our day.
So Narnia.
Yeah, it's like a Narnia situation, except horrible.
You go through a doorway into Narnia.
No, you go into this place.
Where there's a cruel prince.
Fairy. It's called Fairy.
Is there a wicked queen?
I mean, the next book's called The Wicked King, so...
Do any of them have ice powers?
No.
Darn. Okay.
No ice here.
That's where it ends.
Jude. Yeah, okay, anyway. I just think that alone, the, like, telling of why there's this murder in the beginning and then why this happens, like, it's really hard. It was really hard for me to, like, understand what was happening and how the transition happened and what was going on and why this place existed. And this was not good. And I had really high expectations.
So this is an example of poor world building.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you would say it's not like the Malazan one where it's like, boom, too much world. It was not enough world?
I mean, I can, like, picture places. So, like, there's some good visual things, I guess. I think just the reason. Like, why is there this world? I don't know. It just felt a little confusing.
That's an interesting point, right? So not only does world building have to include maybe richness, but often it has to include enough history to define why it's there.
Yeah.
Right, and that's one of the reasons for the history is if you have enough history there, you're like, oh, this world's existed for tens of thousands of years. Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But if you don't know, and it's just a doorway, it requires more to it.
Right. Well, even if this place did exist for tens of thousands of years, I don't know that. I don't feel the richness of it or the I just wasn't into this world building.
Interesting. All right.
Cool concept, though, I guess.
Yep.
Narnia.
Speaking of a great concept, so this is Kings of the Wild, and it uses a type of world building that I think is awesome. You see, it's set in the classical fantasy setting. Dragons, shields, swords, wizards, that type of thing. And it knows that you've read these type of books before.
Cool.
Right? So it's not going to do its job of setting up a world based on that. Instead, what it's going to try and do is subvert your expectations around this world. And basically, the bands of mercenaries that go around are treated as rock bands. And so it takes this idea that we have of how a rock band is treated in our world and treats these mercenary groups that way. Like they perform in front of people in crowds, in amphitheaters, and fight dragons and things like that. And so it takes these two worlds, our world and the way that we respond to rock bands, and a classical fantasy world, and smashes them together, not necessarily trying to do the world building on either side, but instead the world building is the combining of these two ideas into a very rich and interesting thing. It really is basically, if you imagine kind of a Dungeons and Dragons world and rock bands being smashed together, and that is the world building. That really establishes the reason and the means for almost everything. Everything else, there's a few more historical things that are added in there, but all of them are secondary to this idea of, oh wow, what if you took these disparate concepts and put them together? And so it was a really unique and rich way to tell a story and to build a world that isn't in the same richness of like a Tolkien, where you have to have eons of history and ancient things all over the place. Instead, it's like, hey, what if you role-played your D&D group were a rock band? Right? Is basically what it was. Very, very good, highly interesting, and just a fun twist on what you already know, which establishes a strong world.
Sounds very memorable.
Very much so.
So I really apologize because we bring this book up almost every video, but I think our mission in life is for everyone to read this.
It's pretty great.
Ready Player One. So like this happens here too. It's just dystopian.
Yep.
Later in the future, there's like a surplus of bad things happening. Okay, but he lives in the stacks, which is like a trailer park, but like stacked up on top of each other, like an apartment building. And that alone is cool. I didn't love how the movie did it, but I like how my brain did it. And he has this haptic suit, and I guess not in the beginning, but like essentially you can't play your video games until you've exercised and you've done your homework and you've done all of your stuff, but then you can just enter this alternate reality, and that is where the world building is really fun and really creative.
Yep, and again, because it borrows, it does an interesting thing, right? So it borrows from the setting, so it says, hey, you understand Earth, we're going to take you to a dystopian place where the world's going to be built a little bit, and you're going to get some explanation here why.
Yeah, like real human life.
Yep. But then we're going to transport you to a whole bunch of different worlds, and we're not going to have to necessarily explain these worlds other than saying, hey, they're a video game. And by the fact of saying, hey, it's a bunch of video games, all of a sudden you get a whole bunch in here that just makes sense, because for the majority of us, we've played video games. And so...
Or seen movies.
Or seen movies, right? And so being able to say, well, okay, I get it. It's a video game. I can understand why some of these things would be happening. Because it's relying upon that world that's built outside of this thing. And so it doesn't necessarily rely upon a ton of its own history, but instead upon the shared experiences of the people reading it.
Yeah. Really cool. Really like interesting to, because yes, you visualize those places or you've seen it in a game, but then when you're like, oh, if I was walking right there.
Totally.
Like, because you are with this character or characters. It's really cool. Really, really like exciting book.
An incredibly exciting book, and a great example of world building that is at a smaller scale, right? It's not the same thing. The thing I love about all of these is I don't think we have an example of the classical world building that, you know, somebody spent an eon of time coming up with history for it, and the richness comes from there, and that does bring richness. I mean, Sanderson, Jordan, Tolkien, Rowling, there's more Hobb, you know, just where there's so much richness there, like that. There is a place for that. But it's awesome to see the world building at a smaller scale and maybe a little more intimate scale, and still do a phenomenal job.
Yeah, totally.
Now, this has been our I don't know, show, video, YouTube thing on good world building and I guess bad world building as well.
Yeah, lots of differences, lots of fun things to consider for sure.
Totally. Well,
thanks for watching.
Yeah.
I'm Jamie.
I'm Blake.
And we're Blamie.
I guess so.
Bye.
Bye. Don't wave.
I did it.
I did it. Good job.
Oh, no. But I did drop my phone.
Whoops.